Okay, so I'm Lola Young, sometimes known as Baroness Young of Hornsey, which sounds very grand and is a little bit. And I'm the Chancellor of University of Nottingham, which also sounds grand and is. So who are you? Who are all of you?
I'm Beth. I study French and International Media and Communications, so joint honours at the University of Nottingham. And yeah, I'm a student content creator. Yeah, nice to meet you, Lola.
And you too.
I'm Gracie. I study liberal arts, which is a lot of English, linguistics and film. I'm also a student content creator, which is really fun. And yeah, nice to meet you.
And you again?
And I'm Dan, and I'm a second-year history and American studies student, and also a student content creator, but fairly new to it, so just kind of getting used to it.
That's great. So all content generators and all sort of humanities, arts, which is my area. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah. Should we get into some questions?
Yeah.
So I'll kick off with the questions. So in terms of role models, who would you say is your biggest role model, or who's inspired you throughout your career or personal life?
I always find this question a little bit difficult, you know, not because there aren't loads of people who have found inspiration, but because there are loads of people, and they're not necessarily people you would know. So it might be somebody from my childhood, a teacher who encouraged me to read something, or it would be, you know, maybe just somebody. I remember when I was at university, there was a lecturer whose way he conducted himself in meetings I used to like, because it wasn't aggressive, it wasn't look at me, I'm so clever. And so, you know, I don't sort of name any one person. There are lots of books I've read that at different times have been really important. And I think really the idea of role models, you're familiar with that, right? It's a term you come across a lot. Didn't exist when I was growing up. Nobody used to talk about role models, because what the heck would that be? So, you know, with 2 TV channels and most of it sort of American popular culture. So it's an interesting question, but as I say, I always find it a little bit difficult. So does that kind of...
Yeah, I get that. But it's more like, it doesn't have to be famous people.
Exactly.
It can be people close to you. Yeah.
I think that's really important because sometimes... The trouble with people who are called role models is if they slip a little bit, then all of a sudden, you know, that person is no longer a hero. You know, it happened to Raheem Sterling, you know, in the way the press sort of talked about him. On, you know, one moment he was a top role model, and the next minute he's like the devil incarnate because of a tattoo. It's a bit of an unreliable measure, I guess.
So if there's not really got any specific role models, so then what would you say motivates you in your work life, and like how would you stay focused on your goals?
Ooh, another tough question, but for different reasons. I think staying focused, I have to make myself stay focused, because there's so many things I think, oh, that's wrong, I want to do something about that. And then somebody says, have you thought about it? I say, oh, yeah, I'll do that. And then I find myself with, you know, no time to do anything. So I've sort of focused on a sort of area of work which I would call, broadly speaking, around social justice, okay? And it does, I know it sounds sort of slightly weird and self-indulgent to say, but it makes me feel better to think that I've tried to contribute to trying to make things better for other people. And so to me, that's kind of like potentially a win all round. It's hard to say that I enjoy the work, because it involves meeting people who've had really difficult experiences, confronting the people who perpetrated those experiences, trying to persuade politicians to think differently about what's been happening. But to me, I can't imagine myself doing something that wasn't sort of like that. Even in the arts work and the creative work that I do, to me, it's got to have a purpose, it's got to have a point.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Of course. I'm kind of going off that. So obviously you talked about your experience with like arts and social reform. So how do you see the intersection between creativity and activism? And do you think art can be a powerful tool for driving social change?
Yes. That would be the short answer to the last part of your question. But to the early part, you know, so art and social activism. So I love, you know, in a very general sense, I can say I love the arts and I love the creative sector. It includes fashion and everything. But the bits that interest me most are the bits that actually do contribute to this agenda for change.
Yeah.
Because to me, the status quo isn't good enough for enough people. So therefore, if we want to change that, then we have to use every tool we have in the toolbox to do that. And actually, you know, without getting into lecturing mode, if you go back even centuries, and you think about enslaved African, they made work, they made artworks, they communicated across the language barriers using artworks, using visual arts or using dance or drumming or what have you. And although that kind of might feel a little bit weird, but it is that sort of sense of how do you communicate ideas to people, particularly across cultures, across language barriers, across social classes. How do you communicate an idea? And I've seen some examples recently that have been fantastic in terms of very simple, very beautiful in a weird sort of way, but able to communicate an idea that makes people think, oh, this film is highlighting something that's really bad. Yeah. I think I have to talk about this with other people, and who knows, I might even want to do something about it. So I think art as activism, for me, is really important. That's not to say I like it all, and some of it is just too kind of blatant in your face. That doesn't work so well for me.
No.
It's a good question.
No. So your work's been recognised for the OBE for services to like British Black history. So could you tell us a bit about like some of the initiatives or the projects that you've been involved in, and like the areas like that are important to you? And yeah, just to let us know a bit about that.
Yeah, that was an interesting one because, you know, when you get a letter that has the sort of 10 Downing Street on the outside, I thought, well, what have I done? You know, am I going to be thrown into the Tower of London or something? I must have said something wrong. But no, obviously it's an honour. Although to me, again, it's like a tool. It enabled me to be able to speak to people who, weirdly, before, some people who never spoke to me would send me a card and say, oh, congratulations, perhaps we could have breakfast or lunch or tea or something, because it gives you that sort of status, right? So at the time I was working, I think I was still a prof at Middlesex University, but I'd been seconded to Black Cultural Archives as, I think they still call themselves Black Cultural Archives. So I'd done that work in trying to support the archive to get some substantial funding to set up a museum of an archive, I should say, of Black history in Britain and the diaspora history in Britain. But also what I'd done, because like not many people like sitting on committees, right? And I found that I had a particular skill for sitting on committees and chairing them and things. So all of a sudden, not due to me, there are loads of people who've been working in this field for years and years and years and not being recognised. But it was one of those moments where the sector, that is heritage, museums, archives, historic environment, started thinking, oh, we're not diverse at all. You know, oh my gosh, and our visitor numbers are going down, and who's interested in this subject area, and why haven't we got this, why haven't we got that? And then, I know, there's Lola Young. She's got an OBE. So I got all of these invitations, you know, to sit on committees and such like, and that sort of helped to build up sort of my reputation in that area afterwards.
Yeah, so you've obviously come a really long way. You've had some amazing achievements. So can you share a bit about your journey from foster care to your current position now, and what kind of pivotal moments along the way have led you to these kind of big achievements?
Yeah, it's a funny one because, you know, I often say to friends, I don't know how I got here. I don't know how this has happened. All of a sudden, it feels like in one respect. So, and it certainly wasn't like I didn't have that ambition as a child, because I was a little bit depressed for quite a long time. I was in foster home and the foster mother died, and then I went into children's homes and none of them worked out really. And then I was sort of liberated at the age of 18. But it was also very, very daunting to be 18 with no safety net. And so I think that's probably one of those pivotal moments, because I had to think, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to look after myself, literally? I didn't even know how to handle money, because I'd never had any money before, bank accounts, all of these things were completely alien. Now today, if you're in the care system, I think you get a little bit more help and support. And although I had some financial support when I first left, it wasn't like anybody said, this is how you stay, you know, in the black in your bank account. I didn't know, you know, so I was always overdrawn, you know, didn't know anything about that. And so in a way I had to sort of teach myself by, again, reading, but also learning from friends. And the bonus was that I didn't have to resort to parents and say, I think I want to go to drama school rather than be a local government person. And, you know, have that argument. I didn't have to have that conversation. I just said, oh, I think I want to go to drama school, and off I went. So I think that self-sufficiency was what I learned. Because it wasn't nice at the time in being in care, but at least I sort of felt I was growing to be an independent person, because I couldn't rely on anybody else. So that in a way, in a funny sort of way, was quite helpful.
What advice would you give to young people who aspire to create positive change in their communities, and particularly areas related to social justice and equality?
Well, definitely keep at it. I think that it can feel really difficult and lonely, right? Because at times it feels like everybody else thinks differently to you, and therefore you can't make an impact. But I always, again, sort of refer to history and say all of those people who fought for the right to vote, to not be enslaved and so on, it wasn't just one person, it was loads of people. But I'm sure at times the people involved must have felt, well, this is only me. Is it only me that thinks that women should be allowed to vote? You know, and if those people had said, you know what, it's too tough, I'm not going to do this, then we wouldn't be sitting here today as we are. So I think it's important to keep at it, and also to think, and I think this is maybe coming from me as an older person, because now I'm doing a lot of looking back, and I'm sort of thinking, well, what have I done in order to support more people to come into this space and be activists, because that's important. So maybe I could say that you're never too young to think about who comes after you, and to help to support other people to engage. But I think also, at the same time, I try to recognise that it's not for everybody. Not everybody has the desire or the skills, although I think everybody can develop the skills, but not everybody has the desire. And I try not to be judgmental about that. But although I do think that there's enough around us, there's enough evidence for people to understand that we're in a bit of a hole as a species, and that we could do a lot better, and that needs all of us to kind of do our little bit, which will then add up to hopefully some really big changes.
So as someone who is like passionate about the issues like gender and race equality, anti-slavery, wealth disparity and like young people's rights, how do you see the universities like Nottingham contributing to like addressing these societal challenges?
Yeah, it's a difficult moment for universities actually, because in my own personal view, speaking personally, I think the government tries to interfere too much in what universities do, at the same time as not funding them adequately to do what they're best at. And no system is perfect, right? No university is perfect. But I think that, to me, the role of a university is to help people to understand what's going on around them, and what and where things might change or be done differently. And that's not to say that, you know, everything has to be about social change and social justice, but I think that to me there's no point in having universities that simply pay lip service to government. So I think that's a really important thing to do. And I think, you know, from what I've seen at Nottingham, there's a really good level of student engagement in lots of different activities. And many of those activities, such as what you're doing and what's happening elsewhere, does contribute to that idea that we're preparing young people to go out into the world and make a difference. Hopefully it's the same kind of difference that I want to see happening. But then, you know, it's a bit like, to me, I'd rather people voted for a party that I didn't believe in than not vote at all, because I think it's so important. So that's just one sort of small aspect of it. But I do think it's important for universities to provide that space. Now, that's not to say that it's easy, right? And there are any number of topics, particularly amongst the ones that you've mentioned, that will make some people really bristle and think, well, you know, that's not what university's for, or, you don't want all this woke nonsense and all the rest of it. But I happen to think sort of differently to that.
Yeah, it's like trying to instill a sense of care of like those sort of topics within the students.
Yeah, I think that's right, because otherwise, what are we saying? If we say it doesn't matter where you come from, we live in a meritocracy, well, that to me is blatantly obviously not true. No. Because if it were, we'd have a different set of people who didn't all go to similar schools and what have you. So, what are we producing from our systems, that we have a narrow sort of pool of people from which to draw? So that's one thing. So you can't be sort of rosy-tinted spectacles about it. But at the same time, I don't think it's right to say, you will never succeed because there are so many odds stacked against you. Right. We have to empower young people in particular. And I think you do that from being exposed to ideas, many of which come in the form of books and essays and articles, to do a bit of hard graft there. And that's what university is for, to provide that space where you can have safe conversations, even though they might be quite fierce and heated, and be exposed to different literatures and different histories and so on. So, and even in the sort of so-called hard sciences, there are ways of thinking. We do think differently. I mean, it's complete nonsense to say, you set me off now, you see what you've done. It's complete nonsense to say that you can't change history. No, you can't change history, but you can change the ways in which different parts of history are seen. And that's what history is. That's what the study of the past is. Yeah. Oh, look, what we found, we now know that people came from this continent at this time and wore this, that and the other. We didn't know that before. So, of course, we're changing history all the time as we gather more knowledge. And that's all that I'm sort of saying about history, really, is that we can't, this goes back to your earlier questions around that area, we can't keep pretending history was like this one monolithic thing. Yes. And the same with literature. People have been writing in different languages for centuries. Yeah. I'd like to know what they are, what they've been saying. Were they saying the same things as some of the European scholars, or different things? And in terms of science, if we had just stuck with the science that was developing in Europe in the 18th and 19th century, then again we probably wouldn't be here, because we'd all be dead from all the diseases that they thought came from things flying through the air. So it's just a nonsense to say, the past is something concrete which you can't change. We don't have access to this kind of monolithic idea of history, because it doesn't exist.
As a history student, I definitely relate to that. Like, we are constantly finding out new pieces of information, but also sources don't tell the full story. Often there's a lot of stuff that isn't recorded, and therefore it's up for interpretation, and we've got to kind of figure out, almost fill in the gaps and try and create a narrative. But also, obviously, you don't want to impose a narrative. So it's that fine balance, but obviously taking into account all of these things to inform our worldview and what we're doing in the present. And I feel like in Nottingham, I get that particularly in my history.
That's really good.
And I'm constantly learning new things and having my worldview challenged, and from talking to peers in that kind of seminar format we have. So I feel like that really gains me an opportunity to have that outlook and really debate, and I think that's a really healthy thing.
I do too, and can I just say, the way you just talked about that, it makes it sound to me like you're kind of excited by that challenge. But what's interesting is how many people feel really threatened by that challenge. Yeah. You know, so you're open-minded, you're kind of like the perfect example. You come here to learn, and you accept that what you learn one day might be challenged differently in another day. And you find that an exciting challenge, and you want to use that as an intellectual stimulant almost. But why is it then, and obviously I'm not expecting you to answer this, but I just find it bizarre that people would come to a subject and say, well, this is what I learned about history 20 years ago, therefore that's true. Therefore, you can't change anything about that without being, you know, any of these derogatory terms being used. So it's really good to hear you say that.
Yeah, and I think this conversation really highlights the importance of arts. And as someone who does liberal arts, I think the intersection of art as well is like an incredible like subject area. And I know a lot of people are maybe apprehensive about studying arts or going into a career in arts. And I know definitely a lot of my peers have kind of said, oh, like liberal arts, oh, you know, it's not really a study of anything, but I think it is, again, closed-minded. So what kind of advice would you give to young people who are interested in the arts, but maybe are a bit apprehensive to kind of get into it?
First thing I would say is ignore the naysayers, because there are plenty of people in the arts who have a wide range of jobs, if that's your thing. If what you're worried about is financial security, and if that's top of people's minds, which is perfectly legitimate, of course, then there are plenty of people in the arts sector. And I have to say, I'm going to drop something in here, a bit of self-publicity. You may have seen the Christmas edition of University Chancellor, right? And there were 4 of us from Middlesex University. We won, and in the final we beat, you know, one of the top colleges from Oxbridge. We were all arts students. We were all old as well, but I mean, you know, the point is that we all, there were fine artists, you know, architectural historian, me in media and cultural studies and so on and so forth. So it's like we had that all-round sort of knowledge. And I think my argument for the arts is many, many different reasons. One is that openness that you referred to. Yeah. If you're a creative person, you want to pick the bits and pieces out of everything. You want to put things together. It's almost like everything is part of a collage that you're making. So there's excitement in that. So you find the equivalent of a bit of tin foil in the garden, and you think, oh, I can make something of this, and you put that on you stick that in your picture, and then you find a matchstick somewhere. You know, you can make pictures out of things. That kind of creativity is absolutely essential to scientists. Yeah. It's essential if you're in computing. Mm-hmm. And in fact, you know, in my sort of career, when I've met people who run big industrial, you know, proper companies, as it were, commercial companies, they'll say, well, we'll take 50% of the graduates from computing courses into our computing outfit. We'll take 50% from humanities and arts because we find they're more creative. And so there's that. And then there's also the issue about, again, an area that I passionately believe in. Arts helps people to understand themselves and others. I mean, it's so, to me, self-evident, and it's also a great contributor to mental health, mental well-being, and physical well-being in some of the more performative arts. There's many, many reasons why everybody should be doing arts, and what I can't bear is a government which will acknowledge, any government which acknowledges that arts are huge contributors to the economy. I mean, there was a moment where Adele was, you know, represented like a percentage of the GDP of this country. Or if you're only going to think about Taylor Swift and the American example, there's huge amounts of money sort of that contribute to the economy. Why do people come to parts of Britain? Well, when they come to London, they come to see the museums, they come to see the art galleries, so all of this is part of the economy as well as something that's about health and well-being. I mean, you talked earlier about art and activism. You know, how do people persuade? How was it that the government suddenly kind of woke up to the disaster around the post office? Because a person or a couple of people wrote a script that showed a drama on television, and then we all knew that it had happened before, but suddenly it was in the public domain in a way that it hadn't been before, because creative people were involved in telling that story. And I think, you know, people would like to deny the arts. And I think secretly some people are jealous because they really want to do it, but they haven't got the guts.
It takes a lot of bravery to be in the arts. You have to be quite vulnerable and like sharing.
That's another
creativity
point.
as well.
Right. Yeah, you do. You have to kind of expose yourself in a way, don't you? And you if you've written something or created an image or images, and you've got to give it to somebody, or you've got to give it to the world, as it were, and they can say, nah, that's terrible.
Not sure how it'll be received.
Yeah, exactly.
But I also think interdisciplinary conversation is so important, or even studying multiple disciplines. Obviously, I'm joint honours in 2 areas of the arts, but
what's the other area?
So I'm American Studies and History.
Oh, right, okay.
So American Studies kind of encompasses literature, culture, everything, film, photography. But particularly philosophy and maths as a joint honours degree, I think that as a concept is so interesting, and I studied maths at A-level alongside my arts subjects, and I think that understanding one and talking with different people in one helps you in your approach to the other. I feel like I've got a more logical approach to history now, having had that, and that influences my essay writing and things
and a creative approach to maths.
Exactly.
But you see, the thing is that try to understand that a lot of the people who are making policy in the last 5 to 10 years and now had a completely different concept of what education was. I know because I was in it, right? So when I was at secondary school, you were timetabled, so you couldn't mix arts and science. And you couldn't, there wasn't even a philosophy A-level, there wasn't a sociology A-level, there wasn't American studies, all these things weren't even available. So, you've got a cohort of powerful, influential people who think that everything has to be the same way it was for them. They can't understand these newfangled things like philosophy and American studies and history and maths and all that.
It's like you said before, it's like giving people the space they need, because that's one of the reasons I came to the University of Nottingham, because they did a course that was so niche, that was so ideal for me. So I do French and international media and communications. Great. So it kind of combined both of my hobbies, because I really loved French, and then I went to college to do a degree in diploma in media, and then I kind of combined them at university, and I was like, it's perfect, because now I'm learning so much about French history, French literature, French customs, and I get to mix it with the media, and they kind of intersect sometimes.
Think of the world that French opens cinema. Up for you. It's amazing. So and think of all the countries in the world where they speak French.
Exactly. So, and it's just so many great opportunities can come from it, because I'm going abroad in the summer after this year for a whole year to teach English to French kids, and it's I'm really grateful that the University of Nottingham has been such a good university as well, a Russell Group Uni, 100%. And it's doing a course that's perfectly tailored to me and my interests, because I was where else can I go and do this?
It's a really good point. And as you were talking, I was thinking, diplomatic service and all this, it just opens up a whole raft of. So this is why I can't understand why people are so dismissive of the humanities and the arts, because I sometimes think what we should do is to have artists and people involved in that sector go on strike for a day. So no creative stuff on television. Look what happened, the writers in Hollywood went on strike, because then you begin to realise how much it is a part of your life, even down to street art. As you walk along the street and you think, oh, well, that's interesting, something to look at apart from traffic.
Exactly. I think it's because one of our modules was all about just in noticing what's around us, and it's quite fun to see and implement it into your own life. And you're you're walking down the street and you're that's hostile architecture, I learnt about that the other day. And then it's fun to tell your friends oh, do you know the reason why this is like this? It's because of this. And it's so intertwined into our lives and I feel everyone should kind of, like you said, get to know a bit more about the arts so they can really appreciate it. But
I think it should be a two-way thing, shouldn't it? Because I do think that arts students should also know more about science and how the two are interconnected, and not see them as, to appropriate your word, hostile, and not see them as being hostile to each other. And most of, from what I understand, You know, a lot of the world's greatest scientists were interested in arts, and because there's certain things you cannot explain by producing a formula.
Yeah. Certain hypotheses just don't work.
And in that same respect, there are certain things that with maths with maths you can't show art, but with art you can't show maths, that kind of thing. Right. So it's two ways, and I mean, as you were saying earlier, like a day without the arts sector, like imagine not being able to stream music at all. No classical music, no popular music, no radio stations. Like it would have such a huge impact. And that's why the arts are so important. And Nottingham, I think, with its diversity of study, as you were saying, like American studies is so niche. Like, and I'm off to Oregon for a year, and there I'll be able to gain new perspectives on topics as well by having a dialogue with people who are in a completely different culture. So I think even that opportunity as well just demonstrates that like the links Nottingham has and is like that makes it perfect for like studying the arts and just preparing us, I guess, to be
like we're excited to
humans.
make all of these like exciting, learn new things and make exciting memories. But so you've held a lot of positions in like amazing art organisations. So what would you say has been your most memorable moment in these, and like why have they been so significant to you?
Well, there's one that was when I was on the South Bank Centre board. I mean, it's terrifying as well, because there'd been this multi-million-pound makeover, right? Because I don't know if you know the South Bank in London, by the river and Royal Festival Hall and all these buildings. I mean, Royal Festival Hall was opened in 1951, and so, you know, quite old and everything. And so we'd had all of these discussions about how much money, how many millions it was going to cost, and you know, would we be able to raise the money? And there were fundraisers and all kind of things going on. And there were some hairy moments where I thought, oh my gosh, we're going to have to foot the bill for this personally, because we can't find, you know, and I can contribute £10 or something, you know, that's not going to work. Yeah, you know, it's like, well, didn't have those things,
right,
you see. No, there's no such thing as GoFundMe or anything like that, or Kickstart or whatever it was called, you know. So, you know, I know it's hard to imagine that world, and it's not that long ago. So anyway, so I went off to, I can't remember where I went to. It might have been, because I went to the States quite a lot. There was a moment where I went quite a lot to conferences, and I did a bit of teaching out there as well. And when I came back, it had all been done. And I did a double take, literally, because I thought, oh my goodness, it's been transformed. All of that hard work and the anxiety and the terror had kind of been worth it. So on that big scale, that was quite an important moment. And then the other one I would say was around Black Cultural Archives. So there was the big lottery money of several millions, but before that, in order to get on that trail, we had to, again without GoFundMe, we had to raise some money. So we applied to Heritage Lottery Fund, and again it was like up till midnight writing a bid and phoning people and going round, and you've got to get the language right, and you have all these meetings with people, and you're quite well aware that you may end up with nothing. And we did all that, and then it came through in the end, and that was a big moment, because then from that could go on and get the millions that were needed for an actual building.
Great.
So, and then the third one, which I have to mention, which nothing to do with my doing, but I was invited to the opening of the National Museum and Archives of African American History and Culture in Washington.
Nice, wow.
At the opening, you know, there was a huge concert with all of those big stars singing, and Barack Obama and Michelle Obama were sitting downstairs. And then the next day at the actual opening, there was George Bush and Barack Obama speaking, and then seeing the museum, seeing it. If ever you get to Washington, D.C. and have a chance to see it, I really recommend it, because it's by turns kind of gut-wrenching and joyous, because it is a kind of, you know, when you think about the history of African Americans in the USA, that's what, you know, there's those moments of despair and darkness. And as you work your way up the building, you sort of move into an area where you sort of feel, you know, because people have to have hope, right? They have to, in order to have aspirations, you have to hope that things will change. And so you need to give people that sense of it's worthwhile thinking about what a better future looks like. And there's evidence of that there.
Yeah, that's great.
So you talked a lot about these like incredible moments through like your career and personal life. So do you have any, and I know you were talking about hope for the future, what kind of aspirations do you have personally for the future in terms of your career, or what kind of things you want to achieve?
Gosh.
Big question, I know.
Yeah. But it's also because I overachieved for my own sort of ambitions and aspirations. So I don't feel I can ask for anything more, except that I do keep getting asked to do get involved in extraordinary projects, and I just hope that lasts, that people will think I've still got something to contribute, because let's face it, I'm at the end of my career, really. All of my friends are retired and sort of go and see movies and go to the theatre all the time, and I'm sort of saying, no, sorry, I'm working on a bid, or no, sorry, I'm working on a speech or whatever. So I'm fortunate to have been able to have a long career. And but I do think, going back to the hope thing, and something that we talked about earlier, is to try and support as many people as possible into feeling that they have a voice and a platform from which to express that voice, so that they can, carry on and surpass the work that my generation have been doing.
And specifically as Chancellor, like, what do you see going forward with Nottingham? What's your hope in terms of for Nottingham? How do you see the next 10 years or so at this university?
Gosh, yeah. Well, I obviously hope the university really thrives, and I should say continues to thrive. And in spite of, really challenging circumstances that are external and beyond the control of anybody within the institution, I hope that efforts to diversify both the student and the workforce come to fruition, because I think there's still a lot of work we can do around that, especially in terms of thinking about home students and people from the locality. Which, by the way, I when I was in theatre, I was an actor at Nottingham Playhouse. So to me, I have a sort of an affection for the area, which goes back beyond the university. But I do know that this is often an issue particularly with Russell Group universities, because it's almost like there's this aura around them, and some people may not feel that this is the place for them because they wouldn't feel comfortable here. We have to make it clear that this is a place where everybody can feel comfortable and that they belong. That's really important for the university.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
it's
you.
been very interesting.
Brilliant questions.
Really interesting, really enjoyed that.
No, and it's so lovely to interact with you. I've had a whole day of interacting with students, which has been
like
brilliant.
a celebrity.
Oh, yeah.